Hey guys, first regards from here, it's like we're talking about Darktide and what the next enemy faction should be, because currently a lot of players think that Darktide's faction is a little underbaked, and to talk about this with me, I have brought on Mr. E, the most famous Darktide player of all time, right? We're just kidding.
Wow.
What's up, man?
What a honorific indeed. The King of Darktide. Yes, I know the most about the game. At me in the comments if you know more than me. But yeah, I think this is something that's a lot of Darktide players are very keenly aware of and are interested in. We always are speculating it's on the horizon, a new faction. What's it going to be?
We think it's gonna be
Tons of
Genestealers.
options, right?
Genestealers.
Genestealers are the fan favorite. There's a lot of stuff in the lore, in the conversations between characters, and it seems like this has been a Fat Shark thing forever, but they add in more and more voice lines between characters every patch, even without there's no patch notes or anything for it. So like, you'll just be playing, you'll hear a voice line you've never heard before. Chances are it's actually new, and from time to time, those do mention Genestealers. And yeah, like you don't write that stuff in your lore if you're not intending to do something with it, right?
Now, speaking of writing things in the lore, recently for the 500 Worlds reveal for Space Marine 2, they did talk about Genestealers having killed Captain Akaran and the main Space Marine character you actually played as in the campaign Squadron with Chiron. He is now dead to Genestealers as well. So they're a pretty big deal in recent lore, as time has gone on. It's not just Genestealers, really just like Necrons and Tyranids in general have been pushed very heavily to the forefront of all of 40k lore. And having Tyranids show up in some capacity in Darktide, I think makes a lot of sense. Genestealers are on pretty much every hive city I can think of. It's like major in lore
Yeah.
to some degree. And it's a really obvious choice just because, first of all, their units fit in very well with the gameplay mechanics of not Space Marine 2, Darktide. And they also just have a great presence on the hive cities I've mentioned before.
It would make a lot of sense to turn them into a like a hive like a large enemy base opposition. It's kind of hard to sort of wrap your mind around, gee, if they're going to come up with some I don't know, like enemy faction, well, what another enemy faction would be, but any other enemy faction, they'd have to be kind of limited number. But Genestealers, like, if they have been in this hive city for, even like a couple decades, their numbers can really multiply quickly, and that would explain like just the absolute copious amounts of them. Now, as far as how they'd be implemented in the game, they have to be really like careful about that because there definitely are Genestealers that are appropriate for our power level, but there's also some that are, well, canonically would just absolutely destroy the rejects.
Oh yeah, there's
But I
some
think
Genestealers like wipe out
yeah,
Terminator Astartes. Yeah, it's pretty
yeah,
intense.
no problem. Like because
And that's true. That's true
those
for
those
Nurgle
latent
too.
Tyranid genes, yeah, that's true. And also like something that we see in Darktide time and time again is that like I think this is true of all 40k properties, is that like the power scaling of the individual units isn't exactly one-to-one. They do have some license and some liberty with that, where like chaos spawns are represented completely differently in Space Marine 2 and in Darktide. So they could do their own little artistic interpretation. Like demon hosts are represented completely differently in Darktide, and people will say, oh, well, there's such thing as like minor demon hosts, but like, I mean, come on, like,
I mean, it's never one-to-one in any of the
yeah.
40k games. I mean, in Rogue Trader, you have a Sister of Battle blowing through Wordbearer Astartes like it is nothing, and that's just not something that would ever happen in
Yeah.
the tabletop. Hell, even in Space Marine 2, you see that Tyranid warriors should be able to, on tabletop, comfortably 1v1 Astartes, and in Space Marine 2, you cut through like 10 of them at once. It's pretty intense. And obviously, in the game of Darktide, you don't really have these super high echelon units normally, but as we get further into like the updates of the game, new classes, and potentially new factions, I assume we will see some of these higher echelon units because, first of all, the things like Genestealers, things like Demons of Nurgle, Plague Bearers, for example, they are very popular on the tabletop. These would draw new players. And at the end of the day, what Darktide wants to do is make money because it is, Fat Shark's a game company, and Games Workshop wants money, probably more than Fat Shark does, and putting that in games, pretty big deal.
hmm I think that's I think it would be obviously like a really big sell. It would be a big draw for a lot of players to come to the game. Like I think that's probably the biggest thing that Darktide is lacking right now. Like don't get me wrong, I'm very excited that there is a sixth class coming. But I have to believe in my heart of hearts that there is some plans. I mean, Victor Magnuson, the game director for Fat Shark, has said as much, that if they could do anything, if money was no object, if time was no object, they would do another playable or another enemy faction, right? And they know that players want Genestealers, and so what are you going to do? You're going to make the things that players want, right? You're not going to like fight upstream to make something that players don't want. Well, I mean, sometimes Fat Shark does that, but in this case, I think it would be not only like a great fit, but it would like really make the player base happy.
But definitely, as far as other options go for a new enemy faction, I feel like Nurgle Demons would be a pretty good option. Now, I've always kind of been on the fence about the current faction Darktide because Nurgle is a little overrepresented in 40k in general right now. I think part of
It's
that's
so
just
green out here.
I think part of that's just that Nurgle's easy to like put in as like a melee faction.
It's the
Slanesh
zombies,
is not
right?
around for obvious reasons. Korn is also a pretty good choice. You do see that pop up in like Space Marine 1 and stuff like that. But having Tzeentch or Nurgle is just kind of the go-to because like, they're the least
Yeah.
controversial. They have the most interesting units in a lot of cases for an enemy faction, and they really fit into things like strategy games and melee combat games, which Darktide is the latter, of course. And overall, the demons for these guys, they don't really make an appearance in the game besides like the Beast of Nurgle, but having those in the game be pretty interesting. And it's a pretty huge portion of a cult in 40k to be like summoning demons to begin with. So if we
Yeah.
don't get something like Genestealers, having like an expansion on the current units to like properly showcase like, yes, this is a demonic cult. They are going to be summoning like a giant plague bearers occasionally and stuff like that as we, the player, move up in power level with like potentially new classes and stuff like that. Because I mean, at this point, we're going to have 6 after the new release of the whatever the next classes. And
Yeah.
that's going to be pretty, I assume we're going to get more in the future at some point, maybe. So we're
I
going to
have.
have like way more
I'm guessing
options.
8 total would be my guess for like final count, maybe more. But
8 would be a lot.
it would be a lot, but I mean, like it's the number of it's the cap, like the hard cap as far as the game is concerned right now. Like even through mods, you can't create more. So maybe that's what they're gunning for. But the yeah, I definitely think that there is. I mean, there's an argument to be made for both of these, right? We have, of course, the Genestealers referenced all over the place. There's Genestealers on the ship. That's all lored out. It's definitely like canonical, so that exists as a thread they could follow. But also, there is like a storyline thread that's been on hold for a year, but there is something going on with the cult of admonition and the what does she call herself? Man, it's been so long since I played Dark Communion at this point. But basically, like, that's the forces of Nurgle. Like, they're summoning in, people are saying, like, Great Unclean One. Like, it could be any number of things. But you'd have to imagine, when there's a giant pillar of green energy rising into the sky, there's demonic Nurgle forces somewhere here. And I think what the game is could do in this sense is there could be new enemies introduced that doesn't necessarily have to be an entire faction. You could just introduce a couple of new specials or new bosses. Like, what if we get Nurgle demons, but they are instead, special units and boss units, and that's how they're represented. Like, they fight alongside the Cult of Admonition whenever they're on the battlefield, but they don't represent an entire faction themselves. They're more like, they're a support and stuff.
I think that would be a clever idea. Something else I was curious about is like if we did get a Genestealer cult or something along those lines, if we could have a map with multiple factions on it. Space Marine 2 has done this before, where you have Tyranids and Chaos simultaneously, and that's a pretty interesting thing in Darktide. Let's say they fight each other and they fight you, like certain
wow.
sections of the map. That'd be pretty interesting. Because Tyranids, they don't like Chaos any more than Chaos likes Tyranids or anything else on the that they can't corrupt. And Tyranids have actually evolved to consume Chaos with some of their high fleets previously, so it's a pretty interesting dynamic there. And as far as Genestealer cults are concerned as well, there was previously a game called Space Hulk Deathwing that came out way back when, where you were like a Terminator Astartes squad, you went on a derelict Space Hulk, and you had to fight Genestealer cults and stuff like that. Eerily reminiscent of kind of what the sewers at the Hive Cities in Darkside looked like, and it's a pretty cool game. I mean, it's very outdated at this point, but the thing is, people really enjoy like this claustrophobia of fighting these hyper melee focused units of like these Genestealers, and seeing that represented in Darktide with the significantly improved gameplay of Darktide and just Fat Shark's Tide games in general. I think that'd be really cool. I think Genestealers would fit very well into that. and it wouldn't be that hard to implement in terms of like just direct tabletop models, because you don't have to go outside the box of Genestealers too much. They already fit like the archetypes we have for characters in the game
Yeah.
currently, so I think that actually fit very well.
Right. I think that if I had to make my like long shot guess as to how this stuff will be implemented, I think that we will see Nurgle demons first. I think that's much closer to being written in terms of the lore, because we have the storylines in the missions going in that direction. And like I was saying, it just could be a couple of units. It could really push. It could really evolve the gameplay, because that's something that we definitely is in consideration here. They need more like complex units that really kind of push characters, because players are getting so powerful. They know the game at this point. We don't need any more guys that are just like walking around with hammers over their heads trying to bonk you extra hard. We need some like extra special sort of things that you need to have some skill to navigate.
Like the
So I
Karnak
think
twins.
like the Carnot Twins, I think
Yeah.
they're a great example of like what I call Darktide 2.0, where these enemies are running around like fucking anime characters. Like they have all sorts of special moves, as compared to, you know, the bosses in the game, like the Plague Ogre, who has literally like 3 moves that just aren't impressive. So if that happens first, I think there is like a pretty well written history and lore of Genestealers tend to, you know, kind of like wait in hiding until they reach a certain critical mass in order to basically like offer up the planet for consumption by the Hive Fleet. And but in times where like the hive or the latent mass of Genestealers, like their cult is threatened, and it might actually like they might lose the whole planet to Nurgle corruption, say like demonic infestation or demonic takeover of all of essentially the biomass that they could be consuming. They'll rise up, and that's where we could see like, you know, they emerge onto the scene and just take this from being a okay shit, things just got really fucking bad, we've now got Nurgle demons running around, to okay great, yeah, cool, like now we've got a full-blown
Genestealer
uprising of
infestation
Gene
and,
Stealers.
yeah.
And it would be so cool, like you said, to see crossfighting. That's something that hasn't been explored in Tide games so far. I think it's probably very complex AI wise, but
Oh, definitely.
yeah, it would be very cool, and it would add a lot to just the feel of the game if you entered into areas like what's the level in I mean, there's a couple levels in Space Marine that do it,
Like
but
Vox
the
Liberatus, where
Vox
you have, yeah,
Liberatus,
you
yeah,
have the
where
one.
it's yeah, the Thousand Suns are fighting the
They're gonna be adding a
fighting the
new one
Nids.
pretty soon. After like the next one, the next Tyranid operation should also have chaos to some degree. I think that's like
Mhm.
a pretty great way to incorporate all of your gameplay elements into a single mission. Because usually
Yeah.
once a new faction is added, people want to fight the new faction, but some players want to hop back to the old faction. And using all of your assets in the game, I feel is a pretty big portion of like profit letting the player like build around stuff. Because let's say you have unique boss fights on the Genestealer cult versus the Nurgle guys, and you want to be able to have a build for that. Well, then you have to think about the build for both, and that can be pretty fun as long as it's like a modifier and stuff like that. So I think it'd be pretty interesting. And as far as the story goes, like you said, it would make sense that Genestealer cult would not reveal themselves super early, and they'd wait quite a while, and that's why we suddenly see them pop up later. We know there is a Genestealer cult, but like they haven't hit a crescendo yet, like you said, and that'd be a pretty interesting way to actually incorporate them, like a cutscene or something like that. I think a lot of players just respond to that very well, because we all know like a trailer for a new faction would go crazy hard. Like people would just love to see that.
It would be quite insane. I mean, I always envision it as like multipliers to the content for the game, where like, you know, a new map, adding one new map, we currently have something like 25 maps or something. Adding one new map is therefore like a 4% increase in content, right? If you add one new character class, well, the first one they added was a 25% increase in content. This next one we're going to add is only a 20%, so it has diminishing returns. But there's only one faction of enemies right now. If you doubled the amount of enemy variety we had in the game, that would double the content effectively. It would make areas you've played through before play completely differently. And you just have to consider different avenues and different approaches. You'd have to learn different timings. I think that sort of stuff would be very cool. And also, like, if there was infighting between, this is something I always really liked doing in on Vox Liberatus, is like you can pick which faction you want to fight, right? You can kill the one that they're currently actively fighting for free, and then you have to fight the remaining. So if you come across a scene where it's Nurgle cultists and they're fighting Genestealers, you'd be like, oh, do I want to fight through Genestealers or do I want to fight Nurgle this map? And then you can like cull the opposition, and maybe that would like determine what you'll
On
see in the map going forward.
on the note of having a or like a second faction fight another faction, there is a new modifier in Space Marine 2 that's probably the most popular modifier they've added so far. It actually just swaps enemy faction on a map, and like you said, that makes the maps feel way different, adds a ton of replayability, and I think that'd be very cool to see in Darktide. Do you have any other thoughts on like what you would want to see as a next faction besides the Nurgle demons and stuff like that? I really do think it would just be Genestealers, but it's like any final
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I don't know. I mean, of course, I think like my favorite stuff to see is, I mean, as everyone knows, like canonically, I am a Zinchian cultist, so like Zinch is always like a favorite of mine to be included. I love tricksy magic like that, but that would be reserved for if they do some sort of Chaos Waste style expansion. Like that worked really well for Vermintide too, but I just don't see it being incorporated here. I would be extremely contented if we got either of these things.
I definitely agree. Like getting away from the Nurgle stuff a bit would be a very refreshing change. And let's know what you guys think in the comments below about having a Genestealer cult actually show up as an enemy faction in Darktide. Would that be your first pick? Would you see Demons of Nurgle instead, or let's just see a different faction entirely? And as
Yes.
always, thank you guys for watching. Take it easy. Bye.